understand Grigore Alexandru Ghica, you need to understand the world he was born into and why that world was about to explode. We will call him Ghica for short. In the early 19th century, Europe was still living in the long shadow of Napoleon. Kind of like our time, Europe is still built and trapped in a post-World War II mindset and morality that has nothing to do with the problems of Europe today. And Europe, in the decades after Napoleon, had the same issue, in a different way. In Ghica's boyhood, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 had tried to put the old order back together, to restore kings, suppress nationalism. That never works well, and freeze the map of Europe into something the great powers could all agree on and control. It was about keeping power. Metternich's Austria was the policeman of this order, Russia its eastern guardian. The Ottoman Empire, creaking, shaking, more and more called the sick man of Europe, held vast lands in the southeast, including the Romanian Principality of Moldavia. Along with Wallachia, these two principalities were unique, half free and half not free. They lived in a kind of double bondage. On paper, the Romanians were vassals of the Islamic Ottoman Empire, but they were in truth falling under the shadow of Russian influence, which had won a lot of sway through the Treaty of Adrianople in 1829 and imposed the Reglementul Organic, a framework of power making the principalities a Russian vassal in all but name. The Ottomans still held the keys, but the Russians were gaining ground on them. The Romanian-speaking folk of Moldavia and Wallachia were, by the 1840s, growing a strong sense of national identity, trapped between these three empires, neither of whom they ever really felt a part of. They were their own people. Educated young men, many of them trained in Paris because this was another Romance language, something to aspire to, and in Paris the air was thick with liberal and nationalist ideas. Such men came home, fired up with a dream, a united Romanian nation, free from Islamic Ottoman overlords, free from Russian influence and run by its own people through a modern constitution. This was not merely romantic nationalism. It had a clear political goal, the union of the two principalities, home rule by and for the people, land reform, the end of feudal privileges, freedom of the press, the freeing of enslaved groups. It was, by the standards of 1848, a thoroughly good and open-minded agenda, yet it was about to collide with the powers of its day. In the 1840s, the Romanian principalities held a society of stark opposites. On the one hand, it had an elite and ancient culture, Romanian, Orthodox Christian, with deep roots in Byzantine tradition and a Greek phanariot ruling class, whose bonds ran through Constantinople into the heart of Ottoman Turkish power. In the northeast, Iași, the Moldavian capital, was a true city. By the mid-19th century, over a third of its population was Jewish, making it one of the key centers of Jewish life in Europe. The first Yiddish-language newspaper would be published there in 1855, when Ghica was prince, and later in that same city a poet named Naftali Herz Imber would write the words that would become Hatikva, the national anthem of the State of Israel. Now, I need to say, this doesn't mean that it was easy for Jews in the era, nor that Ghica was exceptionally kind to Jews, and they were heavily discriminated against. However, Romania has given Israel a great deal, but that is another video. The culture of Iași was layered, urban, alive. On the other hand, Moldavia's social structure was feudal, its economy overwhelmingly of the land, its peasant majority bound to the land in a state barely above serfdom, and the gypsies legally enslaved. owned by boyar families and the Orthodox Church as property. If you saw my video on Horea, Krishan and Kloska, I'll put it here, you might be wondering, wait, weren't the gypsies freed in the 1790s? Yes, in Transylvania, which was under the rule of the Austrian Empire at the time and not yet part of Romania. Wallachia and Moldavia were ruled by a colonial Islamic empire as vassals, in which a slave trade would continue into the 20th century that snatched Europeans out of their villages and sold them in the markets of Arabia. Anyway, I'm Benjamin Angwin. Let me know what your name is down in the comments. The gulf between the Europe Romanians aspired toward and the empire that ruled them could not be starker. And this tectonic plate between the two caused Romanians to have new ideas. Into this world, Grigore Alexandru Ghica was born, sometime between 1803 and 1807. He came from the Ghica family, one of the great Albanian boyar dynasties that had given princes to both Moldavia and Wallachia in the 18th century. He went to school in France and the German Confederation, coming home fluent in the languages and ideas of a liberal Europe. He was from the beginning a man shaped by two worlds, the Romanian peasant society that his family ruled over, and the modern Europe that he had studied in, which sought to give those people rights. What we're discussing here is an age in revolt against a post-war order. After Napoleon, there was this fear of nationalism. I know this sounds a bit familiar because we're kind of in revolt in Europe against the anti-nationalism of our post-war age. But this has happened before in a very different way. In January 1848, the people of Sicily rose up in revolution to establish an independent Sicilian state. It didn't work, but it was quite vicious. And the revolutions continued. The French wanted to get rid of absolute monarchy and to seek a republic. And you may say, well, wait, that's not nationalism, but it is. The expression of French nationalism became republicanism, which is why the major conservative party in France through most of the 20th century was Les Républicains, the Republicans. This became that. In the German lands, students came out of universities into the streets wanting the unity of Germany. Nationalism, waving the banners of a unified German state. You saw this happen in Sardinia and in Austria-Hungary, Austrian Empire, which became Austria-Hungary largely because of these revolutions. Ethnic groups across the empire rose up wanting their own nations. You saw revolution in Poland. But in France in 1848, in March when this broke out, this would eventually become the catalyst that launched the Second French Republic. And the Romanians wanted a piece of this. Within weeks, the revolution in Paris had spread across Europe like fire over dry grass. In March, Vienna saw rebels unite ethnic groups and liberals against the government. In Budapest, in Berlin, in Milan, in Prague, revolution spread. The order that the Congress of Vienna had tried so carefully to keep was cracking. The post-war order of its day, like ours, was being broken apart by people demanding their own nation-states have rights. In the Romanian principalities, the moment revolutionaries had been preparing for had come. In Wallachia, the revolution was dramatic. The old Phaneriot rulers were shoved away. In June 1848, a provisional government was set up in Bucharest, The revolutionaries published a proclamation, 22 points, including the abolition of serfdom, the emancipation of the Roma, and union with Moldavia. That last bit was very bold. For a brief and breathtaking summer, Wallachia governed itself after centuries of rule by the Asiatic Ottoman Empire. In Moldavia, however, the revolution was put down swiftly. In late March 1848, a petition given to the reigning prince, Mihail Sturza, a deeply conservative man and a puppet of Russian influence. The petition was modest by the standards of the age. It called for constitutional government, freedom of the press, and slow reforms. Sturza's response was to arrest the leaders, scatter the rest, and call in Russian troops to punish them. Moldavia's revolution lasted just 3 days, but in Wallachia the government held for 3 months, and it left something behind: the names of those who signed the petition, who had gathered in the streets, and who had been arrested or exiled. These men would form the backbone of Romanian nationalist hopes over the next decade, and among the men who had allied themselves with the nationalist and liberal opposition to Sturza was Grigore Alexandru Ghica. Ghica had not led the revolution, he had not even been a key figure, but his sympathies were known. He had aligned with the reformers against the Russians and the hardline aristocratic faction. This is not to say that he was anti-aristocratic, no, but his liberal ideas, giving rights to those classes under him. This would define his political identity for the rest of his life. The revolutions of 1848 failed, and Romanians suffered for it. Wallachia was invaded by both Ottoman Turks and Russians. By the autumn of 1849, the order had been restored across Europe. Let me know if you want a video on those revolutions. But in neighboring Hungary, Russian armies had crushed the revolution at Austrian request, which had an effect on Romania later. In Wallachia, Ottoman and Russian forces ended the brief run of self-government, and yet something had changed. The ideas could not be unthought. Networks of Romanian nationalists went into exile, scattered in Paris, in Vienna, in Constantinople, and they remained intact. They kept gathering and planning. The failure of the 1848 revolution had created a generation of new leaders. What 1848 taught this new generation of Romanians was undeniable. Open revolution, barricades in the street, setting up illegal parliaments, armed uprisings, this did not work. The great powers would not allow it. Russia would step in. Austria would not put up with a new large state on its borders. The Ottomans, whatever their own weaknesses, would not allow their vassals to just slip away. They had spent centuries fighting these rebellious European Christians to conquer them in the name of their Muslim ideology. And Britain, for all its liberal talk, was more concerned with the balance of power and trade routes than with Romanian home rule. Open revolution was not a choice, not because the cause was wrong, but because of the realities of power. So what choice did this leave the Romanians? It left the quiet road, reform by stealth, institution by institution, law by law, piece by piece, creating the structure of a new state, an educated people, a free press, a professional gendarmerie, reforming the judges, a new system of owning land, until the principalities would become something that looked like a nation, even if it had no right in law yet to be one. This was not a conscious strategy in 1849. It became one, though, and the man who would most embody it, not by grand design but by his temperament, was the man the Moldavian Divan was about to appoint as their new prince. I should explain this word divan quickly because it's old. 6,000 years old. In the Sumerian language is what this ultimately comes from, dub, meaning like a clay tablet. This passed on. The Persians took it up to be a bundle of papers in a written document in their offices to run their empire. And when the Islamic Caliphate came in and suppressed the native Persian civilization, it became a word in Arabic meaning a customs house or a colonial office position in Arabic. In the Hebrew language, this became like a bundle of poems, a collection of poetry. Later, and sound changes are happening through this, okay, all the way. So divan, it's slowly over centuries. And when the Turks became the major power, they took it to mean a colonial office or house on the periphery, which slowly made it where people gathered to speak, right? And so when Romanians living under this needed ways to organize, to think, like, we're under this Islamic Empire, how do we organize our national identity again? And so the Romanians were forced to rebuild their national identity through some of the concepts of this Islamic Empire that ruled over them. And this divan, this group gathering, became a council in which the vassals were elected under the subjugation of the Sultan in Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, who could approve or disapprove at will. The Russians liked to invade nearby countries, and they invaded Moldavia, whilst Ottomans held the south. Both parties wanted stability, and with hardline conservative Sturdza gone, the Moldavian Divan met with Russian approval to select a prince. Ghica had a bloodline that mixed both local boyars and Phaneriot Greek rulers, which on that side pleased the Ottomans, who were still legally in control at least. Ghica had also served as Minister of Finance, suggesting the stable order which the powers wanted. Ghica was a moderate, and his being a quiet man came across to the Russians as being easy to control. He was not as easy to control as they wished, but they did not know this yet. As a compromise, Ghica was chosen as prince. In October 1849, Grigore Alexandru Ghica was appointed Prince of Moldavia. This was on the surface a paradox. He was known for liberal and nationalist sympathies, and yet chosen to rule a principality under Russian influence. Why would Russia approve him? Well, this tells you a great deal about real politics. Russia needed a man the Romanian nobility would accept. Russia likely thought that a prince, with reforming sympathies but no actual revolutionary credentials, would be easy to tell what to do. A moderate who they could channel nationalist energies through into harmless social justice projects without threatening actual power. They misunderstood Ghica. He did not tear up the treaties, declare independence, or lead armies in the streets. However, in the long run, Ghica was something far more dangerous. A patient, systematic builder who used the tool of law within the system to lay the bedrock of a Romanian state from within the empire. Ghica moved quickly in his first years. In April 1850, he created a corps of gendarmes, modeled on the French gendarmerie, a sort of police force, which would become the roots of the modern Romanian police. It was a small thing on the surface, a police force, but it was also the beginning of a state that could govern itself without the Ottoman or Russian state framework, because after all, if you have a police force, that can in some instances take the place of any occupying force. And using this police force, he relaxed censorship almost at once. The cultural life of Moldavia began to breathe. Literary work grew, International debate bloomed. In 1851, he appointed August Treboniu-Lorian, a Transylvanian-born intellectual and committed Romanian nationalist, as inspector of schools. This was a two-fronted attack. He was stating, through this appointment, that Transylvania was part of Romania even though it was, officially, now under Austro-Hungarian rule. And after this, education became a chariot for the nationalist program, rebuilding the Romanian identity that would in the end demand unification. He reformed farming, trying to create a standard in relations between landowners and peasants, to reduce the working duties imposed on the countryside, to give the peasantry basic legal rights. He was opposed, of course, at every turn by the great boyar families, who saw their privileges threatened. He did not always win, but he won some of his battles, and he kept trying. Maybe he won too many fights. The outside world stepped in. In 1853, Russia invaded the Danubian principalities, using them as a staging ground in its war with the Ottoman Empire. This kerfuffle became the Crimean War. Russia was not going to have him dabbling in nationalism, and he was deposed in June 1853 and went into exile, crossing into Austria and settling in Vienna. This was not the first time nor the last time that Romanian nationalists did so. For Ghica, his first reign was over, but it had lasted long enough to show his nation who he was, the ideal man for the job. The Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 changed everything. Russia unexpectedly lost, and with Russia's defeat, its sway over the Romanian principalities was shattered. The 1856 Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, placed Moldavia and Wallachia under the common oversight of a concert of great powers. Britain, France, Piedmont, Sardinia, Austria, Prussia, and a bruised Russia. The Ottomans did have some say, however, still. The principalities were to have some home rule, no longer under a Russian shadow, with the right to set up their own institutions, with the veto of the Ottoman court. On paper, it was the reformers' dream. In truth, it was a compromise. Austria, which feared Romanian nationalism on its borders, had its own Romanian-speaking populations in Transylvania, and was firmly against a new Romanian state. Britain was suspicious of anything that might disturb its trade routes and the balance of power. Britain was the commercial empire, and did not want the markets to be upset. The Ottomans opposed any reduction whatsoever of their formal empire, but France, the France of Napoleon III, was sympathetic. They did share a Roman inheritance after all, and France had long-standing cultural ties with the Romanian upper class. Many Romanian nationalists had studied in Paris, like Ghica, spoke French, and looked to France as the natural patron of their cause. Napoleon III was glad to see Romania as a counterweight to Austrian power in Central Europe. French support for Romanian nationalism was not altruism, however. It was just politics. This alignment between Romanian nationalism and French interests would be key in the years ahead. Ghica understood their mutual interests and watered it like a tree. When Russian forces withdrew from the principalities, Ghica was called back. Why? Well, this is not uncommon in history. Leaders flee or go into exile, and they take refuge in a country along the borders, and that court or political regime uses that, or they use each other, as an instrument to gain political leverage over the other countries around them. And Ghica was just playing the game. He did it well. He was able to gain power once the situation changed. His second reign began in October 1854. He returned to power with a clearer sense of purpose and a narrowing window of opportunity. The Crimean War was still being fought. The great power talks that would decide Moldavia's future were underway. Ghica had a choice: govern cautiously, preserve his rank, prestige, and hope for the best, or use the time he had to push as far as geopolitics would allow. He chose the latter. In 1855, he moved against one of Moldavia's most shameful institutions. The Roma, tens of thousands of people, had been enslaved for centuries, as I said, legally owned by boyars and the Orthodox Church. Ghica drafted the law for their freedom. It was unanimously voted in. With this one act, Ghica put himself amongst the great reformers of his age. Not merely a modernizer, but a man who understood that civilization requires the freedom of those on the bottom too. He was not doing this in a socialist solidarity way. He understood that there will always be people on the bottom, but they deserve freedom as much as all of us. He kept a fast pace, appointing members of the Partida Nazionale, the Unionist Party, to government office, openly showing his support for unification. He pushed the frontiers of what the Ottomans and Austrians would put up with, allowing a free press that questioned them, but always stopping just short of the line that would bring direct action from them. And in 1856, in February, one of his last and most enduring acts, he abolished censorship, allowing even more direct criticism of the Ottoman regime and the Austrian Empire. It was a quiet act, no armies, no proclamations, no barricades, just a law. But it was a law that would echo for decades, and which echoed French liberalism's influence on his thoughts. Throughout his second reign, Ghica cultivated his bond with France carefully. The Second French Empire under Napoleon III was the most likely great power to help the Romanian cause, and Ghica understood that Romanian nationalism could not win without the support of a great power. The 1848 revolution had made that lesson clear. You could will a nation into existence, but you still needed a patron, willing to put the question on the table at the Congress of Powers. You still needed finances, and say, in far-off courts. France was willing, but France also had its own interests. Napoleon III wanted Romanian unification to happen through the concert of powers, not some rowdy, up-from-the-ground process. He wanted it in a way in which France could claim credit for, not through a grand declaration that would alarm Britain and embarrass Napoleon III. Napoleon was part of a great game of politics going on in Europe. This meant Ghica had to walk a very narrow line. It was a performance that asked astounding political skill. Ghica was genuinely moderate by temperament. He believed in reform, not revolution, and this made him the right man at walking this tightrope, the only one Romania had leading toward independence. However, even a man as talented as Ghica could not please both the Austrians and the Turks at the same time forever. By 1856, the walls were closing in on Ghica from two sides. He had been able to keep the wounded Russians back, largely due to Great Britain limiting Russian naval power, keeping them out of the Danube River Delta. Austria and the Ottoman Empire, on the other hand, had watched his second reign with growing alarm. His appointments of Partida Nazionale members to government ranks was painful for them to see. This was a nationalist party, and they did not want a nationalist government. His open calls for unification, statehood, his cultivation of French interests in Central Europe, all of this had been noted and reported back to the imperial courts in Constantinople and Vienna, and resented. Ghica had fooled them. He had made them look stupid, and now they saw he had never been their man. The Austrians and the Turks had the power to get rid of him. Meanwhile, the Treaty of Paris created the framework for new elections, an ad hoc divan or council that would express the wishes of the Moldavian people to unify Romania into a nation. This was the moment Romanian nationalists had been working toward. Controlling these elections was key, and the anti-unionist, that is, the anti-Romanian nationalist powers in Austria and the Ottoman Empire, knew this. In June 1856, the Sublime Porte of the Ottoman Imperial government denied Ghica's reappointment as prince. In his place, they put in Nicolae Vogoride as caretaker. Notice how that's not a prince. He was an anti-nationalist puppet who could be relied upon to govern as the Ottoman Empire wished. Ghica left. The title of prince was, for a moment, abolished. Ghica had no army, no legal way out, no power to resist. He went to France. Even in exile, however, Ghica did not give up. He retreated to a property in Le May-sur-Seine outside Paris, and from there he kept on fighting for his country. With letters, with lobbying, every diplomatic tool a deposed prince with French connections could muster. The elections for the Divan had been rigged by the empire against him. Lists were manipulated, nationalist candidates were forced out. The results when they came were fabrications. A Divan, a council, packed with anti-nationalists, claiming to speak for a Moldavian people who overwhelmingly wanted a union they opposed. Ghica attempted to persuade Napoleon III to get involved, to demand new, fair elections, and Napoleon III, for all his stated public sympathy for the Romanian cause, refused Ghica an audience. He wouldn't even speak to him. Napoleon III's politics had only been a show. It meant nothing. Ghica, deposed and no longer useful as a political figure, was cast out of public circles. He had given everything to his cause. He had reformed, built, freed slaves, and been removed for it. And now the great power he had most trusted would not even let him speak. The anti-unionist camp in Moldavia saw he was weak and spread allegations against him, attacking his conduct in office, his motives. He was accused of rigging the elections that had been rigged against him. His enemies were accusing him of what they had done to him. I guess that's one way to cover your black dealings. Ghica had no platform from which to fight back. He had no office and no standing, but good news did come. The elections were annulled. France succeeded in that much. New elections were called, but Ghica would not live to see them. On the 24th of August 1857, Grigore Alexandru Ghica killed himself in Le May-sur-Seine. He was 53 years old or thereabouts. He had twice been a prince and a minister of finance. He had freed the Roma, built schools and hospitals, and given Moldavia a free press. The Israeli national anthem had been written during his time as prince. He spent his political life in service of a Romania that did not yet exist. And in that summer house outside Paris, he must have felt that he had nothing left to give. He was buried in France, in Le May-sur-Seine, and there he lay for 168 years, until he was brought back to Romania. In January 1859, less than 2 years after Ghica's death, Alexandru Ioan Cuza was elected Prince of Moldavia. He had been one of Ghica's own appointments. During his second reign, Ghica appointed Cuza as Moldavia's Minister of War. Ghica had brought him into government and given him the platform that made folks see him. And now, through a feat of bold political statecraft, Cuza wasn't just Prince of Moldavia. And this is why Ghica was actually the last Prince of Moldavia. Cuza wasn't just elected Prince of Moldavia on the 5th of January, 1859. Cuza exploiting vague words in the Treaty of Paris that allowed the same person to hold both the thrones of Wallachia and Moldavia at the same time, was elected Prince of Wallachia less than 3 weeks later. The great powers did not know what to do. Romania now existed, not through revolution, not through war, not even through mass unrest, but through a legal loophole, a quiet trick. Cuza was now Prince of a Romania built upon the bedrock that Prince Grigore Alexandru Ghica had laid before him. The principalities were unified. Diolch yn fawr iawn and Willio, thank you very much for watching. And if you'd like to contribute to the channel, subscribe, like, leave a comment, buy me a coffee, donate.